What happened during the Salem Witch Trials? Why do we still talk about it? Maybe it's because it shows the true horror and terror and violence humanity can possess, especially at the hands of mob rule. Let's start at the beginning. What caused the trials? Well, for starters, there were immigrants going into Salem from the American Indian Wars. So they were already predisposed to paranoia. They lived in fear of the American Indians and the horrors that they would do because they were at war with them. And the American Indians' fighting style was incredibly sneaky. You would never know when one was coming, which is great for them, but not for their enemies and not for the immigrants that moved to Salem. So they were already paranoid from living in that. They already had some type of PTSD from it. So it was even easier for them to fall into the lure of witchcraft and horror, and for them to think that there was this great evil infiltrating them. And then there's Wiccan culture. Wiccanism is a religion that is still practiced today and was practiced at that time. They are witches, in a way, but they are not the type of witches that were persecuted in the Salem Witch Trials. They are incredibly different. While Wiccans had a very hard time during the Salem Witch Trials because of their beliefs, they were seen as evil, and in some cases they were charged and persecuted and hunted and treated incredibly horribly. They were not the targets of the Salem Witch Trials. Wiccans were already outside of the community before the trials. They were already shunned. They were already hated. The Salem Witch Trials were persecuting people who were in the inner circles of society. Some were in the dregs of it, others were high up, mostly not, because most of the time when somebody really high up would be accused, it was ignored, but it was against other members of society, usually around the middle class, some lower. So how did accusations in the Salem Witch Trials work exactly? Well, there was a specific group of girls led by Abigail Williams. Abigail was one of the older girls in the village, and she was the main person to accuse people, and she had a little harem of other friends of hers that would back her up on her accusations. In a courtroom, they would claim a witch was doing something, and Abigail would have some sort of reaction, and then as soon as she started having a reaction, all of the other girls had a reaction as well. When she didn't have a reaction, they didn't either.
Why does she see this vision?
She sees nothing! She sees nothing! Abby, you mustn't! Abby, you mustn't! I'm here! I'm here!
Don't try back, you scared.
Mr. Danforth!
Have you compact with the devil? Have you?
Never!
I repeat you!
There's 40! Abby, stop it! Abby, stop it!
She was not by any means the only person to accuse others of witchcraft. However, she was the one who tended to start most of the accusations, and she was part of what started the Salem Witch Trials in general. When she and her younger sister became afflicted with something, and they stared for days on end, they had seizures and convulsions, they had a lot of horrible things, and they were exorcised, and they claimed that their sicknesses were because of witchcraft. And when you look at the girls' symptoms, those long-term symptoms where they would stare into nothing for days on end, they never blinked, they never closed their eyes, they never ate, they never drank, they never sleep, that's not possible. That's not physically possible. So it leads to the question, how did these children, because they were children, at the time of her affliction, Abigail Williams was only about 11 or 12 years old, so how does a child fake symptoms like that? Could she have faked it? Could her and her sister really have faked all these symptoms on their own? Or was there some adult involved? Did their family actually know that this was all fake and they decided to use it to their advantage politically, or was it really all the children? It's obviously impossible to know for sure since we can't go back and ask them. And even if we could, would they even tell the truth? But it is something to really think about, because could they really have pulled that off without some adult helping them? Would they have really put themselves through this? Would they really have starved themselves? Would they really have stared for hours on end without anyone noticing? While it is possible, it is unlikely, so there is a good chance that there was someone in the household, if not their parents, maybe a servant or something, who knew and probably could have done something to stop all of the trials, but they didn't. Or maybe they tried to and then they were accused as witches themselves and hung. We can never really know, and that's one big issue with the Salem Witch Trials. After they realized how crazy everything that they were doing was, they destroyed all of those records, so it's incredibly hard to find reliable sources for it now. So what were witches accused of? Well, there were 4 main pieces of evidence against witches. One was a witch's familiar. A witch's familiar could be any animal, but is often known as a raven or a black cat. However, it really could be anything. Anyone could say anything was a witch's familiar. What a witch's familiar is it is an animal that follows the bidding of a witch and is tied into the witch's soul. And the witch can control the animal from no matter how far away or anything like that. They never have to really be near the witch unless it is time to be fed, which I will get more into later. So at any point, if any animal does anything bad to a person, they could just say, oh, it was Blank's familiar, they're a witch, they did this to me, even if it was just some wild animal doing something crazy. And even more than that is they don't even need to have proof that the animal did anything crazy. They could just say some animal did something. An animal could look at them weird, and they could claim that that was because it was a witch's familiar. And that was admissible in court. The second thing goes off of familiars and is about the feeding, and it is supernumerary nipples. So supernumerary nipples are these bumps that people have on their bodies, which is sort of like a third nipple, and it's not the most common thing, but people do have them, and it is known today, and people know it exists. Back then, not so much. So they saw it as a witch's mark, and they believed that the witch's familiar would suckle from it, and that is how they were fed, and that is how they survived. So if anyone had a supernumerary nipple at the time, that was considered evidence of being a witch. But the sad thing is, it didn't even have to be a supernumerary nipple. They would take any mark that could maybe look somewhat similar to that and claim that that was their witch's mark, and that is what their familiar was suckling. So if you happen to have a mole, you're a witch! Congratulations! Next piece of evidence, specters. That is basically the witch's soul or the witch's ghost, which can go and do things, and nobody can see it except for the people that it is doing the things to. So how do you prove that, you might be wondering? How in court do they prove that a witch's specter did something if the only person who can see it is the person who is the victim? Eyewitness testimony, called spectral evidence. So you say that someone's specter did something to you and they take you for your word. That's it. Yeah. Oh, and there's no defense for it either, because you could claim that you didn't do it, but they wouldn't trust a witch, right? So obviously innocent until proven guilty was very much not a thing in the Salem Witch Trials. Some pretty common forms of spectral evidence would be people saying that the witch's specter would throw their shoes and garments out their window onto the streets. So if they threw their shoes out the window, they could be like, the specter did it! And it's evidence! Yep, people were sentenced to death because somebody threw their shoes out the window and blamed their ghost. That happened. That was evidence that they thought was critical and very much real. And the final most common piece of evidence were dolls or puppets. So they would call them puppets, and they were just these little puppets, and they were basically like voodoo dolls, so they could control people with them. Basically, they had a little doll that they could use to torture somebody, and they could stick pins in it and cause pain or other more serious issues like tripping and falling and breaking bones and things like that. So if you had a child and you have a doll for your child to play with, which by the way was very common at the time. People had dolls. That was the main form of entertainment for children. You were a witch. If you're entertaining your child with a doll, you're a witch, because it could be a puppet. It could be used to hurt people, and you can't prove it wasn't, so if you don't want to be accused, don't have a doll. Of course, then your specter would just be blamed, or hey, a random animal, which is your familiar. There was no real proof involved in the Salem Witch Trials, obviously. But what they did consider proof is so insane because so much of it is so common. Having a doll for your child is so common. There are animals who do strange things. It happens all the time. Happened before the trials, happened after the trials, happened during the trials. But during the trials, it meant a witch was in control of them. So what happened after the witches were accused? They were asked to state whether they were innocent or guilty. If they confessed to being a witch, if they said that they were guilty, they were asked to name other witches and could possibly be excused. They would not be killed. They would say that they would give up their witchcraft, they would basically reform, and they would turn in another witch in their place, or multiple witches, which was most often the case. However, of course, they didn't know other witches because they weren't a witch themselves, so that just meant that they had to accuse somebody else in the town. Really, it was far more likely that they would not get killed if they confessed to being a witch and named some other people than if they tried to claim their innocence. However, many people did not want to do that because they weren't a witch, and they did not want to be thought of as a witch, and they did not want to risk their families by saying that they were a guilty witch, because then their families could be prosecuted for also being witches, especially their children. So many people had different reasons not to take that route. Also, the fact that they didn't want to accuse innocent people because they didn't know who the witches are. But plenty of people did choose to take that route and did accuse other people. Nobody was safe. Not your neighbors, not your family, not your friends. You really couldn't trust anyone at that time. If you did try to plead your innocence, you would be taken to court, and as we have already looked over the evidence, you can see that you really did not have a chance. You would be guilty. However, there was another thing. You could say neither. Not a smart choice, by the way, but you could choose to refuse to state whether you are innocent or guilty, and if you did so, the trial could not take place because they could not put someone on trial if they refused to state whether they were innocent or guilty because they needed that information first. One man named Giles Corey did just that. He refused to state whether he was innocent or guilty, and they could not hold his trial. Because of that, they needed him to state it, and in order to get him to do so, they tortured him by crushing him with stones. So they had him lie down, and they had a plate of wood on top of him, just something to keep the stones on, and then they put a stone on top, and they asked him, "Are you innocent or guilty?" He would refuse to answer. He said nothing. They would put another stone on, ask him again, and the process continued. Put a stone on, ask the question. 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 More and more weight was added to his body as he was slowly crushed to death. His last words were "more weight." When he was asked a final time whether he was innocent or guilty, he said, "more weight." That is all he said during this entire process. They added more weight, and it finally sealed the deal and crushed him to death. But he was not the only one to die because of the Salem Witch Trials without being executed. Plenty of people who were either sentenced already and just awaiting execution, or who were awaiting their trial, were in the jails. And the jails were small because Salem was a small town, and usually they didn't have half the population in prison. So because of that, there was a lot of disease that was going around in the prisons, and a lot of people actually died either before their trial took place or after, but before they were actually executed formally. They died of sickness, and sadly, a lot of children to the accused witches were in prison with them because there was no one else to take care of them on the outside for single mothers. They had to be in that prison, and they died. But the most well-known people who died in the Salem Witch Trials are those who were hung. There are actually many memorials in Salem now for those people, basically apologizing for their hanging and what they did. In total, there were 4 different execution dates in which 19 women and men were hung. On June 10th, 1692, Bridget Bishop was hung. On July 19th, 1692, Sarah Good, Rebecca Nurse, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, and Sarah Wiles were hung. On August 19th, 1692, Martha Carrier, John Willard, Reverend George Burroughs, George Jacobs, and John Proctor were hung. September 22nd, 1692, Mary Asty, Martha Corey, Anne Puditor, Samuel Wardwell, Mary Parker, Alice Parker, Wilmot Red, and Margaret Scott were hung. That was the final execution date. The Salem Witch Trials eventually ended when the governor of the colony's wife was accused of witchcraft. Upon hearing this, the governor took action and went to investigate. He saw how incredibly stupid all of it was and put a stop to it then and there. However, even though the trials were ended and those who were accused or sentenced were freed, it didn't leave Salem, not really. Relationships were damaged beyond repair because in the time of the trials, friends accused friends, Family turned against family, and you couldn't trust anyone, and that trust was not just repaired because the trials were over. It haunted Salem for quite a while. They realized how incredibly idiotic everything that they did was. They were embarrassed and they destroyed all of the records that they could, which is why it is incredibly hard to find accurate information on the trials now. The information that I have already shared is what is best known to people today, but not all of it can be 100% guaranteed as perfectly factually accurate, as the people of Salem wanted to hide everything that they did because they realized how truly horrific it was. And even when that embarrassment faded, the witch trials never really left Salem. If you go there today, all that there is the witch trials. It is a tourist destination now, and plenty of people go to learn more about it. I actually went to Salem a while ago, and I learned a lot about the trials while I was there. The names of those who were hung are scattered throughout the city. Anyone who lives in Salem is constantly surrounded by that now just as much as it was back then. However, it is no longer a hysteria, and there are no longer executions. It is still part of the everyday lives of the people who live there, and I doubt it will ever really go away. But it's incredibly interesting to think about the Salem Witch Trials and how much of an impact it has on today's society outside of Salem itself. When we think of the witch trials and we think of executions, the first place that pops up in most people's minds is Salem. The Salem Witch Trials are easily the most famous witch trials that have happened. However, they were actually the least violent. They had the least amount of deaths, and the deaths that they had were the least excruciating. The methods that they had to figuring out if somebody was a witch or not were the least brutal. In other places, there were many worse techniques and many more people killed, as well as killed by different means. So it is very interesting to consider the fact that Salem is so much more famous than all other witch trials, even though it is definitely one of the least horrific. So everything that is part of the Salem Witch Trials is awful and terrible, and yet there were many places that were much worse. The Salem Witch Trials are in so many pieces of modern movies and television. Just look at these few examples.
Who are you to order us? We felt the wrath of Greendale once, child. We won't be hung again.
No, not hung. Burned.
It's beautiful. Am I familiar?
Sorry, Joanna.
Listen to yourselves. You've no proof Jenny's a witch.
We have no proof she isn't either. And that's good enough for me.
But why is it that the Salem Witch Trials stand out so much more? Who knows? But they do. They really show how violent people can be. The way people turned on each other, the way people used normal everyday things as evidence for witchcraft and malice and evil, and used it to kill people. That's not something anyone wants to think that they're capable of. But at the time, they were. Would we be today? Probably. If we were gripped with the same paranoia as they were back then, we'd like to think that that's not something we would do, but wouldn't we? To save our own lives, would we not accuse someone else? Now, lots of people were just making accusations for their own benefit, to get rid of those that they didn't like, to get rid of enemies. Some people even used it to get rid of wives so that they could remarry, as divorce was not allowed. But there were definitely a lot of people who were just sucked up in the craziness and 100% believed the accusations that they were making. It's scary to think that we as humans are capable of such insanity, and as a group. Not just one single person who we send off to a mental institution, but enough people that we kill in an organized manner. It wasn't just some rampant mob that was attacking someone. Yes, it was a mob, but it was an organized one, and it was in the government, and it was in the people on the streets. It was in everyone. The paranoia was an infectious disease, and it really shows how terrifying humans can be. How much we can do even though we don't want to think that we are capable of it. We are. And it's important to remember that in our day-to-day lives, and to really think about everything we're doing. Are we really doing the right thing? Are we really being a good person? Do we even want to be?
Everything you do, it sends me higher than the moon. With every twinkle in your eye, you strike a match that lights my heart on fire. When you're near, I hide my blushing face, and